Picture the grandest ballroom in all of London. Candlelight falling like liquid gold over silk gowns and powdered wigs. Champagne in crystal flutes. Laughter like music, or something pretending to be music. The cream of English society, assembled in their finest, performing the elaborate theatre they called a season. Now picture, stepping through those gilded doors, a young woman in a dress that had been mended at least 3 times, a dress that had once belonged to someone else. A dress that the women in the corner were already laughing at before she had even crossed the threshold. Her name was Clara Belrose. She was a lady's maid. She had calloused hands and ink stains on her fingers from reading books she borrowed without permission. She had no title, no fortune, no family name worth speaking of in polite company. She had been invited to this ball as a joke, but no one had told the Duke Thaddeus Vane, the coldest, most impenetrable man in all of England, looked up from across that ballroom, and he rose from his chair, slowly, deliberately, as if he had been waiting for her his entire life and had only just realized it. The laughter stopped. Every head turned, and the story that unfolded that night would become the most talked about scandal of the season. Not because a poor maid had walked into a ballroom, but because of what happened after. Stay with me, because this is one you will not want to miss. If you love stories where the underdog wins and the villain loses everything, subscribe right now and leave a comment below. Who do you think Lady Whistledown really is? Dear gentle reader, you think you know what a season is. You believe it to be about courtship, about dancing, about the careful negotiation of fortunes masquerading as romance. How delightfully naive. A season is, at its core, a battlefield. And this particular season, the season of our story, was about to produce a casualty no one expected. Not the girl they tried to destroy. No, the casualties would be the ones holding the weapons. But I am getting ahead of myself. I always do. Her voice, warm and wicked in equal measure, floated over the rooftops of London like smoke from a winter fire. Lady Whistledown, whose true identity had never been confirmed, whose column had never once been wrong, had been writing about the aristocracy for years. She had documented scandals, predicted marriages, and destroyed reputations with the precision of a surgeon and the satisfaction of someone who enjoyed it rather too much. This evening, she was not at her writing desk. She was at the Pembroke Ball, seated in the upper gallery behind a column, her opera glasses trained not on the dancers below, but on the doors. She was waiting for someone, and she had been waiting for a very long time. But we will get to that. First, we must understand the world into which Clara Belrose was about to walk, because to understand how extraordinary her entrance was, one must first understand how thoroughly that world was designed to keep her out. 12 years before the night of the ball, in a house that smelled of beeswax and regret, a 15-year-old boy stood in the corridor outside his father's study and listened to a door close. Not a dramatic slam. That would have been easier to forget. It was a quiet, careful, deliberate close. The sound of a woman making sure she was gone before anyone could ask her to stay. The Duke of Vane, the elder, the father, the man who had built an empire of land and title and cold respectability, had spent 3 months courting a widow from the north. A beautiful woman, clever and warm, who had laughed at his jokes and walked with him in the garden and accepted every invitation he had extended. The boy had watched his father become, for the first time in memory, something resembling a human being, and then she had married Lord Hartwell. For his coal mines. The boy's father never spoke of it. He returned to his study, to his ledgers, to his impeccable posture and his complete absence of warmth, and he stayed there for the remaining 11 years of his life. He died in that study, in fact, still sitting upright. The boy grew into a man who decided, with great clarity and very little drama, that he would never make his father's mistake. He would never allow himself to want something he could lose. He would never look at a woman the way his father had looked at that widow, as if she were the only solid thing in a dissolving world. He was very good at keeping this promise. For 27 years, he was impeccably good at it. Right up until the moment Clara Belrose walked through the doors of the Pembroke ball. Clara Belrose woke every morning at 5 o'clock. Not because she wanted to, because Lady Pemberton's bedroom fire needed to be lit before Lady Pemberton woke, and Lady Pemberton woke at 5:30, and the world would apparently come to an end if there was any variance in this arrangement. She had been in service since she was 16. She was now 22, and she was, by any objective measure, extraordinarily good at a job she had never wanted. She was quick and quiet and unobtrusive in the way that good servants were trained to be. Invisible when invisibility was required. Present when presence was needed. She had learned to read the moods of a room the way a sailor reads the sky. She anticipated needs before they were expressed. She never dropped anything. She never forgot anything. And she read, voraciously, secretly, in the 20 minutes she allowed herself each night after her duties were finished, by the light of a single candle stub that she rationed with the care of someone rationing medicine. She read everything she could get her hands on, novels from the library she wasn't supposed to enter, pamphlets left behind in sitting rooms, newspapers folded and discarded. She read Lady Whistledown's column every week with the focused attention of a scholar, partly because it was brilliantly written, and partly because she suspected, though she could never have said why, that the author understood something about the world that very few people did. That particular Tuesday, 3 days before the Pembroke ball, Clara was tidying Lady Pemberton's writing desk when her hand closed around something that had fallen behind the inkwell. A letter, sealed, addressed to no one, with a crest she did not recognize. A crowned swan on a field of blue. She should have set it aside. She should have placed it with the other correspondence and thought nothing more of it. Instead, she stood for a long moment looking at that crest, her thumb running over the wax seal, and felt something she could not name, something that felt almost like recognition. She put the letter in her pocket. She told herself it was for safekeeping. She did not entirely believe herself. 2 days later, the anonymous invitation arrived. It came in a cream envelope with gold lettering and a faint scent of jasmine, and when Clara turned it over, she found no sender's name, only the Pembroke seal, which she recognized because she had pressed that very seal into wax approximately 300 times in her years of service. The invitation was elegant. It requested the pleasure of Miss Clara Belrose's company at the Pembroke ball, the most anticipated event of the season. Friday evening, evening dress. Clara read it 3 times. Then she went to find her friend Dotty, who was the under-housemaid and who had the useful quality of being impossible to shock. Dotty read the invitation, looked up and said, flatly, that it was a trap. Someone wanted Clara to show up so they could laugh at her. Probably Lady Pemberton herself, or one of her terrible friends. The whole thing had the signature cruelty of women who had run out of more interesting things to do with their evenings. Clara agreed with this assessment completely. Then she smoothed out the invitation, folded it carefully, and asked Dotty if she still had that green dress from her cousin that had never been worn. Dotty stared at her. Clara stared back. There was a long silence. The thing was, and Clara had thought about this, carefully, in the way she thought about most things. She was 22 years old, and she had never once been inside a ballroom. She had carried trays through ballrooms. She had swept ballrooms at 7 in the morning when the candle wax had hardened on the floors. She had stood outside ballrooms listening to music she had never been permitted to dance to. If someone wanted to use her entrance into a ballroom as the punchline of a joke, then fine, let them. But Clara Belrose was going to walk through those doors at least once, and she was going to hold her head at the angle she had been practicing in the small mirror above the servants' wash basin, and whatever happened after that was going to be their problem. Dotty handed over the green dress. It needed mending in 2 places and was slightly too long. Clara stayed up past midnight fixing it. She wore it anyway. She also, in a decision she would later claim was purely practical, practiced walking in it for 45 minutes in the narrow corridor outside the servants' quarters at midnight, because the hem had been let down and she wasn't certain of the length, and because she had decided that whatever happened in that ballroom, she was not going to trip. She did not trip. The Pembroke Ball was, by all accounts, operating at peak splendor when Clara arrived. The ballroom was 3 stories of marble and mirrors, lit by 6 chandeliers that together held more than 400 candles. The orchestra was playing a particularly vigorous quadrille. The floor was full of couples who had spent weeks preparing for precisely this kind of moment. The women in gowns that cost more than Clara earned in a year. The men in coats so perfectly tailored they appeared to be part of a different species. Clara stood in the doorway for exactly 3 seconds before the whispers started. She heard them. She had very good hearing, another quality that made her an excellent lady's maid, and that served her somewhat differently in this context. She heard is that the Belrose girl, and someone else responding what? The maid and the first voice. Again, apparently someone thought it would be funny. And then the laughter, low and pointed, aimed at her like a dart. She walked in anyway. The thing about Clara's posture, and Lady Whistledown would later write about this at length, because Lady Whistledown noticed everything, was that it had not been learned in a finishing school. It had been forged. Years of carrying laden trays without spilling a drop had given her a stillness in the spine that most of the women in that ballroom had never achieved, despite corsets, deportment lessons, and a great deal of suffering. She moved through the room the way water moves, not forcing anything, simply finding the path and taking it. She found an empty chair near the east wall and sat in it. She folded her hands in her lap. She watched the dancing with the same calm attention she brought to most things, and she allowed herself, just quietly, just for a moment, to think that the music was extraordinarily beautiful. In the upper gallery, behind her column, Lady Whistledown lowered her opera glasses, raised them again, and made a small, satisfied sound that no one was close enough to hear. Across the room, Duke Thaddeus Vane was in the middle of ignoring Lord Ashwick, which was his preferred occupation at events like this. Ashwick was saying something about property taxes. Thaddeus was thinking about nothing, which was something he had perfected into an art form. Then, for reasons he would not be able to articulate for several weeks afterward, he looked toward the east wall. He stopped thinking about nothing. He rose from his chair. This was, in the context of who Thaddeus Vane was and how he conducted himself in public, approximately as dramatic as if he had stood up and recited Latin poetry while on fire. Thaddeus Vane did not rise for people. Thaddeus Vane did not cross rooms unless the room contained something he actually wanted, which in the entire history of seasons past had amounted to his solicitor, occasionally a decent whiskey, and once an unusually interesting book left on a side table at Lord Farrow's. He crossed the room now. The quadrille was ending. The dancers were separating, fanning out, creating an accidental corridor between Thaddeus and the east wall, as if the evening had been choreographed specifically for this moment. He walked through it without breaking stride, and people moved out of his way, the way people always moved out of the way of men who looked like they had somewhere to be, and were not particularly interested in your opinion about it. He stopped in front of Clara. She looked up at him. He was tall, considerably taller than she had imagined a duke would need to be, with dark eyes and the expression of a man who had decided long ago that showing what he felt was a form of weakness he refused to indulge. He was, objectively, absurdly handsome, which Clara noted in the same way she noted other facts that were true, but not particularly useful. He said, without preamble and with the air of someone issuing a geographical statement rather than a request, that she would do him the honor of this dance. Clara tilted her head very slightly and said that she supposed she would. The room went completely silent, not gradually, all at once, the way sound disappears when you go underwater. One moment everything, the next moment nothing but a kind of ringing in the ears. Thaddeus offered his hand. Clara took it. They walked onto the floor. The orchestra, after a moment of what could only be described as institutional bewilderment, began to play a waltz. And then someone, no one would ever admit to being the one who said it first, someone said, "She's a maid, you know, a servant," and from somewhere quite close to the dancing floor, in a voice that carried rather more than it needed to, the voice of Lady Pemberton said that the girl worked in her household, that this was all some terrible mistake, that someone must have played a very unkind trick. Thaddeus did not stop dancing. He did not raise his voice. He did not even look in the direction of Lady Pemberton. He looked only at Clara, and in a tone of complete and magnificent indifference, he said, "She was a maid." And then, after a pause so perfectly timed it could have been rehearsed, he said, "Was." The silence that followed was of a different quality. It was the silence of a room collectively recalibrating. Clara, for her part, felt something that she would later identify as the particular vertigo of a moment that is changing your life while you are still inside it. She kept dancing. She kept her face composed. Her heart was doing something extremely undignified that she chose not to acknowledge. Scene 7. Lord Ashwick makes a mistake. The waltz ended. The room exhaled, and Lord Ashwick, who had been drinking steadily since 7 o'clock and who had the confidence of a man who had never once experienced a consequence, walked directly up to Thaddeus and said, in a voice designed to be overheard, that he hoped the Duke was aware of what he was doing. Thaddeus looked at him. This was, for those who knew Thaddeus Vane, already a warning sign. Ashwick continued. He said that the girl had no name worth speaking of, that she had been invited as a bit of sport. That this was, frankly, not the sort of thing a man of Thaddeus's position should be involving himself in, and that people would talk, and that the reputation of the Vane name deserved better than being attached to some. He searched for the word. Some curiosity. There was a pause. Thaddeus said, with the kind of precise quietness that tends to be more alarming than shouting, that he was glad Ashwick had raised the question of reputation, as it gave him the opportunity to note, in the presence of the assembled company, that Ashwick had 3 outstanding debts with Thaddeus's bank, all of them overdue, and that the continued patience of said bank was a matter that could be reviewed at any time. He said this pleasantly. He said it the way someone might observe that the weather had been rather mild. Then he turned back to Clara as if Ashwick had ceased to exist, which, for all social purposes, he now had. Clara had heard every word of this exchange. She had also heard the small, sharp intake of breath from the women standing nearest to her. Not quite laughter, not quite shock, something in between. She turned to Thaddeus and said, quietly enough that only he could hear, that she hoped he was not under the impression that she required rescuing. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite classify. Not offence, not amusement. Something more careful than either. He said that he was not. He said that he had spoken to Ashwick for his own reasons, which had nothing to do with her, and that if she was interested in rescuing herself, she was welcome to it. Clara considered this for a moment. Then she said that in that case, they understood each other, which was more than she could say for most of the people in this room. Something in his expression shifted, almost invisibly, but she caught it. The garden was empty. This was because it was April, and London in April had opinions about whether gardens should be used for moonlit conversations. And tonight those opinions were cold, damp, and carrying a wind off the Thames that made the torches gutter. Thaddeus found it perfectly comfortable. He had grown up in a house where the primary heating strategy appeared to be moral fortitude. Clara, beside him on the stone path that ran alongside the low hedge, pulled her borrowed shawl tighter and refused to shiver. It was a matter of principle. They had not planned to come to the garden together. They had, in the way of two people who are both pretending they are not doing the thing they are doing, simply both ended up moving toward the same door at the same time, and now here they were, alone, which was irregular and probably being observed by at least 4 people through the French windows. Thaddeus was the one who spoke first, which surprised him. He said that she was not what he had expected. Clara said she didn't believe she'd had any expectations extended toward her this evening, given that she appeared to have been invited as entertainment rather than as a guest. He said that was not what he meant. She said she knew it wasn't, and waited. He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the hedge. A torch down the path flared and settled. He said, and this cost him something. She could see the small internal tax being levied. That most people in a room like that one, placed in a position like hers, would have either left immediately or cried. He said it without judgment, just as a statement of what he had observed to be true. Clara said that leaving would have meant letting them win, and crying would have meant letting them watch her win. And she hadn't been prepared to offer either outcome this evening. He looked at her then, really looked at her. She met his gaze without flinching, because she had never learned how to flinch from things that were just looking at her, and because his eyes were, she would not have admitted this to anyone, ever, rather extraordinary, dark and careful, and something else she didn't have a word for yet. He said her name, Clara, just that. Not Miss Belrose, which was the polite form, and not the Belrose girl, which was the dismissive form, but just Clara. The way you say a word when you have been thinking it quietly for some time. She said yes. He said he did not know what to do with her. She said that was all right. She'd been told that before. Then she turned and walked back toward the house, because she had made her point, and because if she stood in that garden for one more minute, with him looking at her like that, she was going to do something extremely impractical with her face, and she had not survived the entire evening by losing control of her face in the last quarter of an hour. He stood in the garden for a while after she left. The wind kept being cold. He didn't particularly notice. He was thinking about his father. He did not do this often, or rather, he did it often and had trained himself not to notice that he was doing it, which is a different thing entirely. He was thinking about the particular sound of a door closing quietly, and about what it costs a person to build their life around a thing that happened to them when they were 15. He was thinking that Clara Belrose had also had things happen to her, worse things, arguably, and with less cushioning of title and fortune, and that she did not appear to have constructed herself around the wound the way he had. He was thinking that she was, of all the people he had encountered in 27 years of a life, he had deliberately made small enough to keep safe, the only one who had made him feel that making it small was a waste. This was an uncomfortable thought. He had it anyway. The encounter happened in the small music room off the east corridor at 10:20, when the ball was in full momentum, and therefore no one who mattered was paying attention to the rooms that had nothing in them worth seeing. Clara had gone to the music room to breathe. This was all. She needed 4 minutes away from the collective gaze of the aristocracy, and the music room had a window seat and a piano that no one was currently playing, and a door with a latch. She had just latched the door when someone knocked on it from the other side. She opened it and found herself looking at a woman she had never met but recognized immediately, because everyone in England recognized Lady Whistledown, or at least everyone who had seen her described, with her distinctive silver-streaked hair and the particular quality of her attention, which was like being studied by someone who had already finished her conclusions and was only verifying. Clara stood very still. Lady Whistledown walked past her into the room, sat in the chair beside the piano, and said that she hoped Clara would forgive the intrusion, but she had been waiting for this particular conversation for approximately 6 years, and she would rather not leave it to chance any longer. Clara closed the door. She sat on the window seat. She waited. Whistledown looked at her for a long moment. Then she said that she had known a man named Edmund Belrose. Not well, she said, but well enough. He had been a lord, a minor one, a younger son, the kind of title that comes with the name but not the money. And he had been, by the assessment of the people who had loved him, which were not many but who had loved him greatly, one of the better people she had encountered in 30 years of observing an industry largely populated by worse ones. Clara said, very quietly, that she had never known her father. Whistledown said she knew. She said that Edmund Belrose had died when Clara was an infant, and that the woman he had loved, Clara's mother, had died shortly after, and that the child had gone into the care of distant relations who had, in the fullness of time, placed her in service. She said that Edmund had left documents, a letter to his solicitor, papers establishing Clara's legitimacy, because the marriage had been legal, though secret, and the secrecy had come from his family's objections and not from any absence of commitment. Clara felt something shift in her chest. A door she hadn't known existed, opening. Whistledown said she had kept those documents because the time to produce them had not been right until now, and that she was aware this might seem manipulative, and that Clara was welcome to be angry about it. Clara said she wasn't angry. She said she didn't know what she was. Whistledown said that was perfectly reasonable. Then she said that the crest on the letter Clara had found in Lady Pemberton's desk was her father's crest, and that she would very much like to know how it had come to be in Lady Pemberton's possession. Clara reached into her pocket. She placed the letter on the piano. They both looked at it. Lady Whistledown picked it up. She turned it over. She said, with a precision that suggested this was not surprise, but confirmation, that it would appear Lady Pemberton had known who Clara was, had perhaps always known. The music from the ballroom filtered through the walls. A waltz. Clara said, slowly, that would explain why Lady Pemberton had wanted her in this room tonight. Whistledown looked at her with something that might, in a less guarded face, have been admiration. She said precisely. And then she said that she intended to write about this, about all of it, and that she wanted Clara to know before it happened, because she had not always given people that courtesy, and she was, in her later years, making some minor adjustments to her methods. Clara said she understood. She sat for a long time after Whistledown left, watching the candle on the piano throw shadows against the ceiling, and she thought about a man she had never known who had tried to leave her a door and had not lived long enough to open it himself. She thought about the name Belrose, which she had always carried as a kind of placeholder, her mother's name, or possibly her father's. No one had ever been entirely clear, and which was apparently something more specific than she had imagined. She thought about 6 years of waking at 5 in the morning and lighting someone else's fire and arranging someone else's hair and folding someone else's letters, including, it now appeared, at least one letter that had in fact been written with her in mind. She thought about Lady Pemberton, the particular cruelty of someone who looks at a young woman and sees only an obstacle to her own convenience, and who decides that the cleanest solution is to make her disappear, either by keeping her ignorant of what she is, or by humiliating her so thoroughly in public that no one would think to take her seriously afterward. She thought that she was not, precisely, angry about this. She was something colder and more clarifying than anger. She was decided. Whatever happened next, Clara Belrose was going to navigate it standing up. It happened at 11 o'clock, which was the peak of the evening, the moment when the champagne had been flowing long enough that everyone's better judgment had softened, when the orchestra was at its most ambitious, and when the assembled aristocracy was, in Lady Whistledown's later estimation, at its least attractive and most itself. Lady Pemberton moved to the centre of the room with the practiced ease of someone who had staged many theatrical moments in her life and knew how to use space. She raised her voice, not to shouting, but to that particular carrying register that fills a room without appearing to try. She said that she felt compelled, as hostess, to address an awkward situation that had been allowed to continue rather too long this evening. She said that through some unfortunate confusion, the word unfortunate doing considerable work in that sentence, a young woman had received an invitation to this event who was not, in fact, a member of society. She said that she bore no ill will toward the young woman in question, that these things happened, that no one should be blamed. She said the name Clara Belrose. She said that Miss Belrose was, in fact, her own housemaid, which must be terribly embarrassing for the poor girl, and that perhaps it would be best if, She didn't finish the sentence, because Thaddeus Vane had stepped forward. He had not planned to speak. He had, in fact, been standing at the edge of the room running a private cost-benefit analysis of every possible action available to him, which was how he handled most situations that required him to feel something. And the analysis was not going well, because every option that didn't involve speaking seemed inadequate, and every option that did involve speaking required him to do something he had not done in 27 years. Want something he could lose. He stepped forward anyway. Lady Pemberton turned to look at him. The room turned to look at him. He addressed himself entirely to the room and not to Lady Pemberton, which was in itself a kind of devastating social statement, because it suggested she was not worth addressing directly. He said he was grateful for the clarification regarding Miss Belrose's background, as it saved him the inconvenience of a formal introduction to her family connections at a later date. He said this with perfect neutrality. Then he said that he was, as of this evening, making his intentions to court Miss Clara Belrose, formerly known to the assembled company, which, as everyone present was aware, constituted sufficient public declaration for the purposes of the season's protocols. Someone dropped a glass somewhere, possibly on purpose, possibly not. He continued. He said that as to the question of Miss Belrose's suitability, he found himself unconcerned. He said that the Vane name had survived 400 years of history, 2 civil wars, a regicide, and 3 successive dukes who had been, by all historical accounts, objectively terrible at governance, and that he was fairly confident it would survive a courtship that the small-minded chose to find controversial. The room was silent in a completely new way, not the polite quiet that follows a social breach, the loaded, recalibrating quiet that follows a shift in power. Lady Pemberton's face had performed a complicated journey through several emotions and had arrived at something between fury and calculation. She said, tightly, that this was all very touching, but that there were things about Miss Belrose's origins that the Duke might not be aware of, and that perhaps a conversation in private. Thaddeus said that he was aware of exactly as much as he needed to be aware of. Then he excused himself, turned, and went to find Clara. He found her in the doorway to the east corridor. She had heard everything. He knew she had heard everything because she was standing with her arms folded and the expression of someone who is working very hard to determine what they actually think about what they just witnessed. She said she supposed she should thank him. He said he would prefer she didn't. She said that was fortunate, because she wasn't sure the thank you would have been entirely sincere. She said she was grateful that he had spoken. She was not grateful that he had made a decision about her life, using her name, in front of a room full of people, without asking her first. He opened his mouth, closed it. This was unusual. She said that she understood what he had intended. She said she understood that he was, in his way, trying to do the right thing. She said that she had spent her entire life being placed in situations by other people, placed in service, placed in this ballroom as a joke, and now placed in a courtship she had not agreed to. And she was not angry at him the way she was angry at Lady Pemberton, because his intentions were different, but that the result was the same. Someone else deciding what her story was. She said she was not going to be the argument he used to win a debate with a room full of people he didn't respect. There was a long silence. The orchestra had started something slow and melancholy in the ballroom. The corridor was cold. Thaddeus looked at her, and for the first time in the evening, possibly the first time in years, he looked at her not as something he wanted to protect, or something interesting, or something that had surprised him, but as a person, a specific and full, complicated person who had a right to exactly the word she had just said. He said she was right. She blinked. She had not entirely been expecting that. He said it again. He said she was entirely right, and that he had managed it badly, and that his motives had been, he searched for the word, not purely about her, and that he was sorry for it. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Something passed through her expression too quickly to name. She said, "Good night, Your Grace." She walked toward the door, and Thaddeus Vane stood in the corridor and understood, with a clarity that was almost physically uncomfortable, that he had just been given a problem he had no idea how to solve. Scene 13. The library and the education of a duke. He found her in the library. This was not the Pembroke Library. The ball was still in progress, technically, though many guests had opted to quietly dissolve into the night after the events of the last hour. But the small private library on the second floor that Clara had remembered from her years of employment in the house, the one with the window that looked over the garden, the one where the good books were kept, because Lady Pemberton had no interest in good books and had never thought to lock the door. Clara was standing at the window when he came in. She was holding a book she hadn't actually been reading. She'd had it open in front of her for 10 minutes and had not retained a single word. She turned when she heard him, and she did not look surprised to see him, which told him she had perhaps not been entirely surprised he would come. He said he would like to start again. She waited. He said that and here he stopped, and she watched him try on several possible words and discard them. The announcement, downstairs. He said that she had been correct, that it was made incorrectly. He said that what he had intended, underneath the incorrectness, was to tell her that he, another pause, longer this time. She thought she could actually see the mechanism of his formidable self-control putting up a fight. She said his name, just Thaddeus, not your Grace. He looked at her sharply, and she thought for a moment he might object, but he didn't. She said she had been in this house for 6 years. She said she had watched him at 3 separate events hosted by Lady Pemberton, from behind doors and through gaps in curtains, because that was what her position had allowed her. She said he had never once, not once, done anything merely because it was expected. She said she had noticed that. She had noticed it very specifically. He said that she had been watching him. She said everyone watches everyone at these things. She said she'd just had a better vantage point than most. Something shifted in his expression. The corner of his mouth moved. This was, she would learn later, the equivalent of another man laughing at full volume. He said that what he had meant to communicate, downstairs, before he had managed it with the finesse of a man who had spent nearly 3 decades actively avoiding exactly this kind of communication, what he had meant to say was that he would like her permission to court her, properly, on her terms, with her awareness and consent, and the ability to tell him no at any point, for any reason, without ceremony. He said he was aware this was unconventional. He said he was aware that his delivery this evening had not been his finest moment. He said that she was... And he stopped again. And this time the pause was different. It was the pause of someone saying something for the first time that they had been privately thinking for longer than they wanted to admit. He said she was the most genuinely interesting person he had encountered in a very long time, and that he intended to tell her so, and that he would leave now if she wished him to. Clara closed her book. She said that she had a condition. He said of course she did. She said that she would not be a kept secret or a private project. She said that if he intended to court her, he would do so in full view of the people who had laughed at her this evening, and that she would not adjust herself or diminish herself or pretend to be less than she was in order to make anyone comfortable, including him. He said that he would not want her to. She studied him for a moment, looking for the crack in it, the place where he was performing rather than meaning it. She didn't find one. She said that, in that case, she supposed they could speak further. Tomorrow, if he called at a reasonable hour. He said what hour she considered reasonable. She said that she would be available at 10. He said 10 was fine. She said she knew it was, for a man of his position. He said she had a point. He left. The door clicked shut behind him. Clara sat down on the window seat and looked at the garden below for a very long time, and let herself feel, just for a moment, all of the things she had been keeping very carefully behind her eyes all evening. Then she folded them up and put them away, because there was a great deal still to navigate, and she needed to be sharp. But she let herself smile, just a little, just for the garden to see. She also, and she would not have admitted this to anyone, ever, under any circumstances, including legal compulsion. She also held the closed book to her chest for a moment, in the way people hold things when they are containing something too large for their usual posture. Then she put the book back on the shelf, straightened her dress, and went to find Dotty. This author has, in 30 years of chronicling the habits and hypocrisies of English society, witnessed a great number of evenings that claimed to be important and were not, and a small number of evenings that did not announce themselves at all and changed everything. The Pembroke ball of this particular April was, without question, the latter. What occurred there, the entrance of a young woman of previously unknown lineage, the intervention of a duke who has long been assumed incapable of intervention, and the spectacular overreach of a hostess who had made the catastrophic error of knowing more than she should about a secret she should not have kept, will be discussed in these pages now, and in drawing rooms hereafter, for considerably longer than Lady Pemberton will find comfortable. The column appeared the following morning at 7 o'clock, as it always did. By 8, it had been read by approximately half of the people who had been present at the ball. By 9, the other half had received their copies through increasingly urgent means. By 10, Lady Pemberton had experienced what her physician would later diplomatically call a constitutional episode, and her drawing room had received exactly 0 callers. Whistledown had written everything. She had written about the invitation that Clara had received. Anonymous, malicious, designed to humiliate. She had written about Lady Pemberton's discovery, 6 years prior, that her new lady's maid was the legitimate daughter of Lord Edmund Belrose, whose modest estate she had long coveted and whose legal heir, if acknowledged, would complicate certain property arrangements that Lady Pemberton had been quietly manoeuvring toward for years. She had written about the documents, about the solicitor who had held them, about the letter with the crowned swan crest that had somehow found its way into Lady Pemberton's desk. She had, in short, done what she always did. She had told the truth. She had told it elegantly, devastatingly, and with such impeccable sourcing that there was no credible avenue for denial. The final paragraph of the column read as follows: "This author will note, for the benefit of those who prefer their morals stated plainly, that the young woman who walked into the Pembroke ball last evening as a subject of mockery will walk out of the season as something rather more, and the woman who orchestrated the evening's entertainment will find that the joke, as is so often the case, was entirely on her. London can be cruel, but it can also, on occasion, be just. One must simply be patient enough to wait for the season." Lady Whistledown had signed it, as always, with her name. And then, beneath the signature, for the first and last time in 30 years of publication, she had added a single line in smaller type. It read, "I knew your father. He would have been proud." He arrived at 1 minute to 10, which Clara noted and which told her something about him that she filed away with the other things she had been quietly cataloguing. She received him in the small sitting room at the front of the townhouse where Dotty had found her temporary lodging, a situation arranged with remarkable speed once it became known that Clara was potentially the heir to a modest but perfectly respectable Belrose property, and that the Duke of Vane had publicly expressed a wish to court her. London society moved slowly on everything except social recalibration, at which it was extraordinarily efficient. He sat. She sat. Dotty produced tea and then vacated the premises with the practiced discretion of someone who very much wanted to listen at the door but had been told explicitly not to. The morning light was good. Clara had noticed that before. That morning light is more honest than candlelight, shows the angles of things more clearly, doesn't allow the same softening. He looked the same as he had the night before, exactly the same, which she found either reassuring or concerning, and hadn't yet decided which. He said he had read the column. She said everyone had read the column. He said he supposed that was true. He said, and this was delivered with a careful neutrality that she was beginning to recognize as his particular way of approaching things he wasn't sure how to say. He said that if she found, in the coming weeks, that the attention of the season became uncomfortable or unwanted, he would understand if she chose to withdraw from public engagements, including any engagement that involved him. She said she appreciated the offer. She said she didn't intend to withdraw from anything. He said he rather thought she wouldn't. There was something in his voice when he said it. A warmth, very small, very carefully contained, like a candle flame in a tall room. She poured the tea. He watched her do it with an attentiveness that was slightly disconcerting. She said, without looking up, that he was staring. He said he was aware. He said he had been doing it since last night, and he couldn't seem to stop. He delivered this information the way he delivered most information, as a flat statement of observable fact. But the fact itself made her look up at him, and she found him looking back at her with the expression she had been trying to name since the garden, and she finally had a name for it now. It was the expression of someone who had decided, she said, quietly, because the room was quiet and the morning was honest, and she had decided that she was going to stop keeping things behind her eyes, at least in this room, at least with him. She said that she was frightened, not of him, of the size of what was happening, of how much she did not know about the life she was apparently about to step into, of how easy it would be to be wrong about this, and how much it would cost if she was. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that he was frightened too. She said she found that very hard to believe. He said she should try harder. He said that he had spent 27 years ensuring that nothing could touch him, and that in the space of one evening she had made an absolute ruin of that project, and that he was dealing with the consequences with significantly less equanimity than he would prefer. He said this with a precision and a flatness that was somehow, inexplicably, the most romantic thing anyone had ever said to her. She laughed. Actually laughed. Not the polite, contained sound she used in company, but the real one, the one that surprised her slightly. He looked at her when she laughed the way people look at something they have wanted to see for a long time. She said all right. He said all right what? She said all right. She would allow him to court her. On the terms she had stated, she said she would give him the honest version of herself, and she expected the same. And if at any point either of them found the situation untenable, they would say so directly, without drama. He said that was exactly the kind of arrangement he had never thought he would want. He said he found, to his moderate surprise, that he wanted it extremely much. She held out her hand, not to be kissed. She extended it the way you extend a hand when you are making an agreement between equals. He looked at it for a moment, then he took it. His hand was warm, and she had not been expecting that. She said, "Welcome to the arrangement, Your Grace." He said he supposed, given the circumstances, she might call him Thaddeus. She said she already had. Last night, in the library. He said he remembered. He said he had found he didn't mind. She said she had found she didn't mind either. They sat for a moment in the morning light with their hands still touching across the tea table, and neither of them said anything more for a little while, because nothing more needed to be said, and they were both, in their different ways, people who understood the value of not ruining a good moment with additional words. He stayed for 2 hours. They talked about books. He had opinions she found insufferable, and then gradually found herself agreeing with, which was worse. He believed that the novel was a fundamentally inferior art form to the essay, because it required the reader to do too much work excusing the author's structural choices. She said this was the most wrong she had ever heard anyone be about anything. He said he was open to counter-arguments. She provided 7. By the time she had finished the 4th, his expression had shifted from the flat attentiveness she was beginning to recognize as his version of engaged to something that she might, generously, have called delighted, if delight in Thaddeus Vane didn't present itself so differently than it did in other people. They talked about the property dispute, which his solicitor was apparently already handling with considerable enthusiasm, because nothing delighted a solicitor like a clear case of document suppression combined with an identifiable injured party and a defendant who had made the tactical error of keeping written records. The Belrose estate was modest, a small manor in Hertfordshire and some associated farmland. But it was Clara's, legally and unambiguously, and the process of establishing that would be, his solicitor had estimated, a matter of months rather than years. Clara said she didn't know what to do with a manor in Hertfordshire. He said that was all right. She said she was being serious. He said so was he, and that it took most people considerably longer than a morning to know what to do with property, and that she might allow herself some time before deciding. She said that was probably the most sensible thing he'd said all morning. He said he had his moments. They talked about Lady Pemberton's social future, which they assessed together with a shared clinical precision that said more about their compatibility than either of them fully registered in the moment. He said the country, probably. She said almost certainly. He said that Lady Pemberton's circle of allies had already begun an elegant dispersal, the way people in society always disperse when the wind changes, smoothly, without apparent hurry, and with absolutely no acknowledgement that they had ever been allied in the first place. Clara said she found that almost more interesting than the original cruelty. The original cruelty was simple. The dispersal was an entire sociology. He looked at her when she said this with the expression of someone adding data to a calculation they had already privately completed. He told her, unprompted and without particular ceremony, that his father had loved a woman who had chosen a coal mine over him. He said it in the flat way that people say things they have carried so long, the weight has become a kind of neutrality. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said that was a heavy thing to have watched at 15, and he looked at her with a slight surprise, as if he'd expected either dismissal or excessive sympathy, and had received instead something much more accurate and therefore more useful. She said that she thought the thing about a wound like that, watch that young, was that it didn't teach you that love was dangerous. It taught you that wanting was dangerous, that the vulnerability of wanting something you might not get was the actual terror. She said she understood something about that, though her version of it had been smaller and quieter and more daily. He said he thought it hadn't been smaller. He said he thought it had been precisely the same size, just differently housed. She looked at him for a moment after he said that. Then she poured more tea, which was a way of having a feeling without having to perform the feeling. And he seemed to understand this, because he accepted the tea without comment. She told him about reading books by candlelight in a servant's room barely large enough to contain a narrow bed and a chair. She told him about the letter, about what it had felt like to hold something that might connect her to a father she had never been allowed to know. He listened with the focused attention of someone who had decided that what she was saying was the most important thing in the room, and in a room without rivals for that status, the impression was overwhelming. At 12:15, he stood to leave. She walked with him to the door. The hallway was narrow enough that when she moved to open the door, he was close, and the close proximity produced the particular kind of silence that has its own texture. He looked at her. She looked at him. He said that he believed, given the formal declaration of courtship and the agreement reached this morning, and given that the terms of their arrangement included honesty, he should be honest about the fact that he had been thinking, since approximately the garden last night, about, and he gestured, slightly, which was the most inarticulate thing she had ever seen him do. She said she knew. He said good. She said that since they were being honest, she had been thinking about it too. He said good. She said so. He kissed her. It was not the dramatic, consuming, orchestral kind of kiss that the romance novels she had borrowed described in considerable detail. It was careful and warm and brief. And then he pulled back and looked at her with the expression she now had a name for, the expression of a man who had decided, and she thought that she preferred this to the orchestral version considerably. She said that was a very restrained kiss for a man who had just made a public declaration in front of all of English society. He said he could be less restrained if she preferred. She said she would take that under consideration. He said he would show himself out. He showed himself out. She stood in the hallway and pressed one hand against the wall for a moment, for structural support, which she was not going to admit to Dotty under any circumstances. She breathed in twice, out twice. The hallway was narrow and slightly cold and smelled of old wood and beeswax, and it was, she thought, the most beautiful hallway she had ever stood in. She was aware this was not about the hallway. She was also aware, and this was the thought that required the wall, that she had spent 22 years being very careful. Careful with hope, specifically. Careful not to extend it past the length of the room she was currently in, because extending it further had historically resulted in disappointment she didn't have the luxury to recover from. She was aware that she had, somewhere between the garden and the library and this small hallway, extended it considerably. She was not, on reflection, as frightened of this as she had expected to be. She straightened up. She went to find Dotty. She told Dotty nothing specific and everything general in the way that people do when they have news too new to be formed into sentences yet. Dotty, who had known Clara for 6 years and who could read her the way Clara read books, said only that she needed more tea and perhaps a biscuit, and that the green dress had been a very good decision. Clara said she had never doubted it. This was almost entirely true. Dear reader, you will permit me, on this occasion, a small indulgence. I have been writing about this city and its inhabitants for 30 years. I have watched fortunes rise and dissolve. I have watched love be mistaken for convenience, and convenience be mistaken for love. I have documented the extraordinary capacity of the English aristocracy to be simultaneously powerful and ridiculous, which is perhaps its most enduring characteristic. I have, in the course of this work, maintained a careful distance. I have been a witness. I have not been a participant. This story is the exception. Clara Belrose is the daughter of a man who was kind in a world that did not reward kindness. She is also, it appears, the kind of woman who walks into a room she was invited to as a joke and makes the joke entirely irrelevant by the end of the evening. I find this greatly satisfying. I suspect Edmund would have too. I knew him, as I have said, rather better than most. He was quietly remarkable in the way of people who do not announce themselves. I see something of him in her, in the way she holds a room without needing to command it, in the precision of her observations, in the fact that she does not soften herself for anyone's comfort. As for the Duke of Vane, London has been waiting for that man to feel something for the better part of a decade. The fact that he chose to feel it for a woman who would not allow him to feel it incorrectly suggests that his judgment, whatever his other qualities, remains sound. Lady Pemberton, for those who inquired, she has retired to the country. Her property arrangements are under legal review. She has not been seen at any social event since the ball. This author feels, on the whole, that this is a reasonable outcome. And to Clara, if she reads this, and she will read it, because she reads everything, which is one of the things I most admire about her, I will say only this. Your father left you a door. You opened it yourself. Whatever comes through it next is entirely your own. This column will not speculate about weddings. That would be premature. This author is not in the business of premature speculation. She is, however, very much in the business of being right. And on this occasion, as on most, she is entirely confident that she is. Yours, as always, Lady Whistledown. And that, dear reader, is the story of the Pembroke Ball, the night they invited the poor maid to laugh at her, the night the Duke rose from his chair and crossed a room and changed the direction of 2 lives, in the time it takes an orchestra to end one waltz and begin another. The night Clara Belrose walked through a door she was not supposed to walk through, and found, on the other side of it, not mockery, but everything else. If this story moved you, subscribe for more. Drop a comment. Did Thaddeus deserve Clara from the beginning, or did he have to earn it? And tell me, who do you think Lady Whistledown really is?